So some exciting news coming to us about CANDID Records, which I didn't know until I realized recently was an affiliate subsidiary of Cadence Records. And Cadence has Don Shirley and some kind of not really jazz stuff. But CANDID was started like in 1960 or so. Nat Hentoff, the great A&R critic, was the A&R guy for CANDID initially. And he wants to represent the jazz of the day. He's a pretty broad swath under his palette knife. He wants to really represent jazz from what's happening in the current era, but also he wants to connect it with the roots and the players of years gone by. They have chosen to reissue 5 CANDID titles, and they're great selections. The Booker Irvin's fantastic. The Booker Little is fantastic. The Pee Wee Russell record with Coleman Hawkins, outstanding. I've heard the Clark Terry, but I don't have it. And the Cecil Taylor, I've only just sampled it and I never bought it. It's earlier Cecil Taylor than his Blue Note stuff, so he's not as far out off the map yet. But Cecil Taylor, he's just not a guy I listen to a lot at this point in my jazz career of listening. But still a great record and very hard to find. CANDID records, for the most part, are pretty tough to come by. I'll pull some of my CANDIDs off the shelf and show you what some of the great stuff they did. CANDID's output is pretty extensive. However, it does end up being, if I remember, CANDID goes to a European company and it's continued over there. A popular singer, if I remember, also ends up buying it. Andy Williams ends up purchasing CANDID at one point, releases some under his Barnaby label, but a lot of it does get issued in Europe at that point. And but they were an important figure on the scene, kind of in the between cracks label that didn't have quite the promotion or budget or power of some of the bigger jazz labels. Some people love their art department. I'm not a big fan of some of the CANDID artwork. I think the colors are muted, and maybe it's some of it just in the repressing. Old CANDIDs are tough to come by. I think most of us come to CANDID through Charlie Mingus for the most part. This is Richard Williams, Newborn in Town, number 9003. A nice little set. This is the Booker Irvin, That's It. And Booker is a Texas tenorman with a great amount of soul, a great amount of expression, some of Coltrane and Rollins' tonality, never as far out as a Train, even though he does sprinkle his toes around the edges sometimes. Irvin's still rooted in the Texas blues for the most part. Big sound, big boisterous tone. Big Booker Irvin fan, and his work's always pretty expensive. Jazz Reunion, Pee Wee Russell with Coleman Hawkins. This record cooks, man. These guys are playing their butts off. It's got Joe Jones and Bob Brookmeyer on it. It's New Orleans meets modern. It's fantastic, and it'll really throw some surprises at you. Mingus, of course, 9021. And there's a lot of titles on CANDID I don't have yet. It's not my favorite label. A lot of it's fairly out. The Mingus stuff even is fairly tough to listen to if you ask me nowadays. This is Newport Rebels with Mingus, Roach Dolphy, Roy Eldridge, and Joe Jones. A great little... Newport was quite the documentation and proving ground space for a lot of the up-and-coming players and even established guys like Joe Jones and Roy Eldridge to experiment with new sounds. Charles Mingus presents Charles Mingus on CANDID, number 9005. It looks like that was on a sequence. Number 9002, We Insist. This is also one of the real early CANDIDs we get exposed to. Max Roach has a fairly big name. This record has a fairly big reputation in terms of its civil rights activism and its political sway. Abby Lincoln screaming. Coleman Hawkins participations of note. And Max, of course, is just pushing the boundaries. Olatunji's on there. So that's a pretty important record. Straight horn of Steve Lacy, a great soprano sax player. And Lacy's, again, kind of a forgotten guy. I think this is a Barnaby reissue. It is. And I think possibly that's why the cover seems photocopied versus having the bright sheen and quality of other labels from that era. I don't know if I've never seen an actual CANDID of that, but I feel like a lot of these covers have that same issue. This is an actual original, and this one has a better look to it. Abbey Lincoln, straight ahead. Again with Max Roach, Coleman, Hawkins, Eric Dolphy, Mal Waldron, Booker Little, Julian Priester, Art Davis, and Walter Benton. So she's really playing with some of the edgier pieces of the jazz puzzle at that point. The great Booker Little out front, and Booker Little was, of course, responsible to fill the shoes of the great Clifford Brown and Max Roach's band after Clifford passes. And the chair jumbles around a little bit between a few guys. Kenny Dorham sits in it for a minute, but it ends up being Booker Little's chair to fill for several years. And Booker makes 4 records of his own as a leader, all kind of in that 59-60 era, and they're all fantastic. Max is on most of them, and then Booker Little sadly passes out of the Memphis lineage. There's some great guys from Memphis coming up into Chicago and then spreading out in the jazz diaspora. And this is Jazz Life. It's a compilation, if memory serves, of just some of the artists on the label. So CANDID's a great label, and as you can see, those 5 titles are going to be reissued soon. And if you're into the experimental edges of the music, CANDID's a great place to go. It's a great documentation of cutting-edge 60s jazz. And it's not going to be as out as some of that Coltrane, Pharoah Saunders stuff, Archie Shepp, happening at Impulse in 65, 66. This is a little bit before that, but it's still a very interesting time. And I'm trying to remember, was it Steve Lacy? I think he made his career of doing a lot of Monk songs. I can't remember. I think it's Monk. Lacy kind of has a lot of albums dedicated to Monk's music. I think it's a Monk. Someone will tell me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. But CANDID's a great little label, and they got some exciting stuff coming out. Another new record I just received in the mail is a record by an artist who I'm a big fan of. He's slipped into a great deal of obscurity in the present, and I think if it weren't for his one record on Impulse, few of us would come across him. Impulse, as much as any label, except for maybe Blue Note, tends to make collectors collect them. I think it's the black and orange spines primarily, and of course Coltrane's broad swath of work. You end up with a big chunk of those spines anyway. And I think it just kind of draws you in. And the spines, I've seen more collections with big Impulse sections, and of course you're going to notice those spines because of that color coordination versus any other label. But I think it's the one label, even more than Blue Note. I've heard a lot of people say I have everything, or I have most of it, or I have the first 150, which is what I have. I have the first 150 plus about 30 or 40 more that come after that 150, but they're not all simultaneous. They're sprinkled out at that point. And there's some stuff I like in that later. I love Gobbler's Oboe, and a lot of his stuff comes later. But this singer was just a real East Coast, Mel Torme, Joe DeRise kind of crooner, soft, velvety presentation, yet usually is backed by a great jazz band. And jazz singers, as much as they're defined by how they approach the music, and do they alternate the melody, and do they add rhythm and cadence to sing like a horn player, that's one aspect of jazz singing. But as I've said before, a jazz singer is also kind of measured by the band that's backing them. And a lot of the great jazz singers, their great stuff is often dictated by the label, the production, the ensemble behind it, and you can almost suss out the good records by a Julie London, by a Peggy Lee, by, you go down the road and name a Sinatra, Johnny Hartman, all the great singers. Is this backed by an orchestra and a string ensemble and a big label orchestra? because that's gonna lead to a bit more of a saccharine sound, and it's gonna sound more pop and American songbook. And not to say that stuff can't be great, but by the same token, when you get a Teddy King record on a Storyville label, and she's backed by a small jazz trio, that's gonna sound just very different. And so the backing group is of great importance to how a jazz singer is going to sound and present themselves. And it takes a fairly great jazz singer to be in a saccharine orchestral setting and still evoke any kind of jazziness. And you can take the same song by 10 different singers, and it's as much the backing orchestration, production, jazz ensemble that will impact that version of that song as the singer impacts it. And I think a lot of singers will also be forced, obligated, compelled, not even by the producer, maybe even by their own propulsion of how they sing, to kind of match to the sound of what's around them. If you're going to sing with strings, you'll probably sing a little more rigid and a little bit more professional and opulent, versus when you're playing behind some bluesy jazz trio, you can kind of relax and be expressive and put a little more gospel and I told you so's in there. Al Green, one of the great soul singers of all time, Reverend Al Green. One of the guys that really drew me into black music. And I had heard a lot of R&B and Motown stuff, but Al Green's unwatered down black music. It's not Motown. It's not presented for white America. It's not dressed up properly and put a little, make it safe. Al Green was always in a leather pants and a topless with, sexy. He was always very alluring to the ladies. And Let's Stay Together is one of the great records of all time. And I really like all of his high stuff from those first 4 or 5 records there. Call Me. I just love all those records. They're outstanding. But Al, one of my favorite songs by him is, believe it or not, a Bee Gees song. How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? And when you've heard the Bee Gees do it with its polish and its beautiful harmonies and melodies, you're like, that's a great song in and of its own self. But when you hear a guy like Al Green do it, it's stripped down, it's got that Memphis funk. They can play the softest pocket funk you've ever heard. And the horns will get these accents and flares straight from the jump blues lineage. I mean, the black music train, it's all linked. But when you hear him do How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, he adds some gospel to it. And part of that's just your inflections and your tonalities and your guttural utterances. But sometimes it's also a simple thing as, how can you mend a broken heart? And mine is, he threw in there, like the pastor. And mine isn't part of the lyric. It's his adaptation. It's his black church. Mine is. Amen. Can I get a holla? It's just a natural impulse to embellish and to add feeling, connection, that connectivity, that tissue that binds the singer to the word. And mine is an important little piece of, and it's always that kind of kicks my butt. I'm like, oh man, mine is too, and you just feel it. Al Green's so special. If you don't know Al, you got to dig Al. And Al Green's Greatest Hits is a great place to start. It has, most of those big songs of his version of the Temptations track, Can't Get Next to You. I'll take Al's version every day. I can't get next to you, babe. It's so sick, dude. It's so beautiful. I love Al. But again, it's that gospel inflection, that punching in your little extra feeling that separates great jazz singers from the rigidity of more orchestral settings. But anyway, enough about all that. Jackie Paris is who I'm talking about. And his record on Impulse is pretty expensive, pretty tough to come by, as most of his body of work is. He has a great record on the Atlantic sub-label East West. Tough to find. And he's got a session that he recorded for Emercy Mercury, that I think only got issued on the Wing sub-imprint of Emercy. It was right towards the end of the Emercy era, and some stuff wasn't getting issued like it was supposed to have been. The Japanese have, of course, reissued the great Jackie Paris on Embassy Recordings, and it's great stuff. But one I had read about but not come across much was Skylark on the Brunswick label. And part of why I sometimes don't discover things when I should is I'm often searching by labels, and Brunswick's a label I've kind of recently said, okay, I'm going to add some more Brunswick stuff. I always had a few pieces, a Count Basie piece, a few things here and there, but Brunswick's very much more of a mainstream label. I know them more from their soul acts, like the Shylights. But they delved into jazz deeply for a few years, like 50s, early 60s. And what a great cover that is. You can't see it very well. It's just a beautiful cover. And it's a beautiful crooner. Again, it's with the orchestra directed by Neil Hefti and Norman Layden. So it is going to be a bit more saccharine than some of his more jazzy recordings. But again, he's such a beautiful, velvety voice that I just love delving into his albums. His versions of songs I find are just wonderful, seminal recreations of tracks. It's a bit like Johnny Hartman. You always love Johnny Hartman's version of a song. I always love Jackie Parison's version of a song. It's always just a great take. And that's part of the fun of jazz vocals, is to hear different renditions of the same song. To hear a guy like Jackie Paris do a song that Billie Holiday's done, you're going to hear two very different renditions of that song. I heard the great Jack Teagarden singing the fantastic song Stars Fell Out in Alabama tonight. And it's a song I've heard Billie Holiday do 1,000 times. But hearing Jack Teagarden do it, Jack brought some guts to it as well. And Jack's got that kind of slightly gravelly, some impact of Armstrong on his tonality, but he's also got just kind of his own gruff grandpa sitting on grandpa's knee. He's this old, clever, wise man, Jack Teagarden. And so hearing him sing that song, it was very rewarding and different from Billy, you know. And of course, I've heard the song done by a lot of people, but that's part of the fun of this music. So I was happy to get this Brunswick version of a Jackie Paris album. And again, he doesn't record a lot. This is one of the last things from his era. And one of the other issues we have is I do printouts of artist labels, discographies. And so oftentimes once I have 3 or 4 records by someone, I'll do a printout of their discography from Wikipedia, and then I'll highlight the things I got. But I don't do it until I get enough records by someone. And I never printed out a Jackie Paris page because he has so few titles, which in that case you forget about things like that record on Brunswick because I don't search that label much and I don't search the artist much. I'm searching by labels and I'm finding other things. And so even though I've seen this before and knew that it existed, Skylark, I never actively sought it. And I think this is when I made my trading card for him a few weeks ago. I was like, oh, I forgot about that Skylark record. I should look for it. And I made an offer on one and tracked it down. So that's another cool piece. We'll leave today's episode at that. Some fun stuff. There's so many great players in this music. I'm going through the Keynote box set. It's 21 records, and I'm going to present it to you when I have a better digestion of it. There's some great stuff on there. Harry Lim really presents some of the fantastic chapters of the changing art form. And in the 40s jazz it's just being shoved in this grater and coming out as this new sausage. The swing era is no longer compatible. It's no longer profitable. The bebop era has a limited scope. And so there's this new modern era of small group recordings happening at Aladdin, happening at Commodore, happening at Keynote, that's pushing out the new, happening at Savoy. It's pushing out the new sounds. And Minton's is this proving ground where they're playing all hours of the night, trying out new things. And these little labels like Keynote and Commodore, who are both located in book record stores in Manhattan, is allowing them to record the real. Billie Holiday couldn't record Strange Fruit for Columbia. They're like, or I think it was Columbia? They wouldn't take it. They're like, we're going to have protests. We have some black ladies singing and complaining about the lynching. We don't complain about lynching in America. Not yet. I mean, it does turn my stomach, but my God, American white folks just love a good lynching. We can't have a song protesting it on our label. It's mind-blowing, And Columbia was as forward thinking as any big label was, but they weren't going to touch that. So she went to Commodore, and they were willing to track it, and put it out. And it's, of course, become now a linchpin of Holiday's career, and even a linchpin of the civil rights movement, and how we even see Billie Holiday is largely shaped by that strange fruit hanging from southern trees. So an incredible era in the 40s of a lot of stuff that we're disconnected from. There's an extinction event in jazz that happens partly due to the war, which just kills off a lot of labels and a lot of careers and a lot of big bands and destroys a lot of what was. And then after the destruction of that comet, there's this post-war 40s music of a changing and evolving landscape, post-apocalypse. But then there's this rapid forced change, forced evolution of the industry from the 78 era into the 33 and the third era. First to the 10-inch LP, and then shortly after to the 12-inch LP, which is also an extinction event. The cost of overhauling your entire production line to change to one format and then do it again shortly after, it does kill a lot of small labels. So there's this double extinction event. And in between these two events exists this bubble vacuum of music that really doesn't connect to today's collectors because the labels are all different. It's a whole different promotion, and we're just not getting it promoted to us. And so we're not really knowing or learning about this great 40s music that sonically, musically, is absolutely connected to what's happening in the early 50s. Post-bop, hard bop, the cool, all that stuff is absolutely linked to these small group recordings of the 40s, including the beginnings of bebop. It's all relevant. And as I said on my Facebook group, the seesaw that is bebop teeters and is grounded to the foundation of these small group recordings happening with Lester Young and Coleman, Hawkins and Billie Holiday, Count Basie 7, all these great little small, Teddy Wilson, Lionel Hampton, they're all shaking it up. The Jazz and the Philharmonic's taking shape, and that's being done by Mercury, then eventually by Clef, and then eventually Verve launches. There's all this crazy transition happening. And when you go from the 50s to the 60s, there's very few labels that disappear right then. I mean, Bethlehem kind of stops to operate, and is King putting stuff out on that name. Riverside Jazzland ceases in 62 for financial reasons. But it wasn't like they hit that decade marker and just they drop off. The labels cross that decade. Very few of the 50s labels that we love have much lineage in the 40s. Savoy's the primary exception. And you could say, Blue Note goes back to 39. It does. But the recordings of the Blue Note label in the 30s and the 40s are very disconnected from the Blue Note that we know today. No one's talking about the Art Hodes and the Sidney Bechet stuff from Vogue and in Paris. People aren't connecting with that stuff. George Lewis. And there's some fine stuff being recorded by Blue Note. The Boogie Woogie recordings. There's some fine stuff happening. Mead Lux Lewis and that whole group of guys. But it's not the modern jazz that we know of in the 50s and 60s. However, the stuff at Keynote and Commodore and Aladdin is very modern and is very grounded and linked to what's happening in jazz in the 50s with the cool, the West Coast sound, the cool bop sound, the hard bop sound, the post bop sound. It's not as clearly separated as we think. And the way we think some of that stuff is so dated, a lot of it just depends on what you put on and what you listen to. Some great stuff's happening. So we'll dig more into that as I dig more into that Keynote box set. I'm 2 records in, and I'm taking my time because I want to digest it, so I could give you a really good article on it eventually. But again, I have to always keep learning. A shark needs to swim to breathe. And so I'm always kind of growing and trying to learn more and collect more so that my grasp of the jazz world is as rooted as it can be, and I can speak about it as fluently as I can. And that's one of the things that I really am noticing is as I'm learning new stuff, is the jazz world is getting smaller, finally. And it's so infinite for so long that the universe seems like it has no end. And I'm not by any means saying I'm near the end of my learning. I'm just saying that the universe is finally getting smaller, where I understand the terminologies, most of the names that are referenced to describe someone. I know most of those names now. Like, it's like there's this connectivity that's starting to happen as I start to encapsulate more and more decades of this music and get a better understanding. And I still got a lot to learn about the 20s and the 30s and the 40s even. I got the 50s and 60s pretty well down. 70s, I know, don't like a lot of it. 80s has some great stuff with labels like Progressive and Concord. Trend resurfaces, Storyville resurfaces, Steeplechase. So there's a lot of good traditional mainstream jazz still happening in the 70s and 80s. But it's just such a wide swath of American history. And I'm starting to slowly get to the point where it does seem like the universe is getting smaller. And I'm understanding and knowing more of the reference points as I'm learning new things. I'm like, oh, I've been on that highway before. So the highways that intersect my new learning, the new roads I'm taking, there's landmarks. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that street. Oh, I know that highway. That overpass, I've been up there. Okay. And so it's making the grid map in my head more completely and safer for me to speak about things in a very fluent context where I don't have to spend a lot of time looking things up, and I've always kind of spoken very from the cuff. I don't use scripts. It's always just kind of a flow and a natural release of thought and process and information that's all kind of congealed. Partly how I learn things is why I can express a lot of the stuff as I can, because I like to learn sequential things and graph things and understand chronologies and sequences and cross-reference dates. It's a bit of my analytical, I don't say prowess, but it's what I do well. And it allows me to understand shifts, changes, adaptations, copycats. I can kind of see that stuff clearer and clearer as the water's silt settles. So, CANDID, great stuff. Looking forward to that. Keynote, keep watching because I got a good episode coming on that soon. Appreciate you all. Talk to you all soon. Peace. Harry James, one of the most talented people to ever pick up a trumpet. I think he gets a little underappreciated, in part because of some of the saccharine recordings he made as a white musician for white labels, for white consumers. But the guy was a virtuoso, on par with any of the greats. This recording is from the late 40s, if I recall. And we're going to hear some virtuosity here that reminds me of a Clifford Brown or a Dizzy Gillespie, coming from someone that we wouldn't expect such playing from. This is Flight of the Bumblebee. And he breaks off some playing here that's nothing short of astounding. I'm going to pull it down for a second. I mean, the embouchure control on a trumpet, it's like I said, it's Clifford Brown like, Dizzy Gillespie. Virtuosity of the highest level. And it's amazing how much talent existed in the jazz era. And Harry James, of course, was known as one of the great sight readers. He was called the Hawk when he played with Benny Goodman because he could just read the charts by sight without having to rehearse them. He just could read them as he went. But this is, of course, a Harry James Columbia 10-inch. Like I said, I think it was recorded in the late 40s, which puts him ahead of a lot of the innovation of the Dizzy Gillespies and the Clifford Browns. And we know Dizzy's already, inventing bebop 44, 45. And so I'm sure Dizzy had some impact on a guy like Harry James, but Harry James was in a different universe in terms of jazz popularity, jazz sales, his place in the jazz landscape. He's a pretty big giant luminary as opposed to a guy like Dizzy Gillespie, who for the most part was just kind of still arriving.